In our parsha, where Moshe Rabbeinu is relating how he went up to take the luchos from Hashem, the pasuk says, uses a few times the expression luchos ha'avonim, luchos habris. Rashi brings the word luchos, and he explains, he says, luchas ksiv, meaning to say that the word luchos is spelled without the vav, so it can be read as luchas, which would then mean, instead of tablets, it could be read as one tablet. And it's sheshteim shavos, it's telling us that they were both equal. Both stones, both luchos were equal, were similar to each other. Now, before continuing into the next part of the Sicha, just to clarify, the way Rashi wrote his pirush, he doesn't have psukim numbers for each pirush. It just goes in order of the psukim, his pirush. So sometimes you cannot be sure which pasuk specifically Rashi is referring to if the same word appears a number of times in that same area. So now back to the Sicha. Rashi does not tell us which pasuk he's quoting the word luchas from and explaining it as luchas. But from the spacing, from the place where Rashi had put in this pirush, which is in between his pirush on pasuk tes and his pirush on pasuk yudches, it's understood that he's quoting the word luchas from somewhere in between those two psukim. In fact, says the Rebbe, since in those psukim that are in between tes and yudches, it says several times the word luchos. In pasuk yud, it says vayitein Hashem elai, Hashem gave me as shnei luchos ha'avonim, the two stone luchos, ksuvim, etc. In pasuk yud aleph, it says vayihi miketz, at the end of arboim yoim v'arboim laila, at the end of 40 days and nights, Hashem gave me as shnei luchos ha'avonim, luchos habris. In pasuk tesvav, it says Vo'efen, Moshe Rabbeinu says, I went down from the mountain. Ushnei luchos habris al shtei yodei, I'm holding the two luchos habris. And in pasuk Yud Zayin, Moshe Rabbeinu is speaking about how vo'etfois, I took hold of the two luchos, and I threw them down and broke them in front of your eyes. So we have to say that Rashi means either one of these psukim, or in fact the word luchos that say missing the vavs in all of these psukim. But Rashi is definitely not referring to the two times it says luchos in the beginning of pasuk tes, where it says ba'aloisi ahara, where Moshe Rabbeinu says, when I went up to the mountain to take the luchos ha'avonim, luchos habris, because again the place where Rashi put in his pirush, where he put in his pirush luchos, Rashi says after his words, after explaining the words va'eshev bahar, which says later on in pasuk tes. So again, in summary, in pasuk tes it says twice the words luchos. Rashi only comments on words later in that pasuk, not on the words luchos. He comments on the words va'eshev bahar. He comments on the words va'eshev bahar, which is later in pasuk tes. In the next few psukim, it says a number of times luchos, and that's where Rashi is clearly quoting the word luchos from. So the Rebbe's question is, the idea that luchos is missing the vavs, and this teaches us that the two stones were equal. In truth of the matter, is this something that Rashi told us already earlier on in Parsha Sicha? On the pasuk Vayitein el Moshe, that Hashem gave to Moshe when he finished speaking to him at Har Sinai, the pasuk says he gave him the two luchos ha'edus, luchos even. There Rashi says that luchas ksiv, it says there also without the vavs, shahayu shtei and shavos, that they were both equal. So why is Rashi repeating over here? Since that previous pirush said, with an interruption of quite a number of parshias in the Torah, in fact, it's more than 2 chumashim away, so Rashi is repeating it again in our parsha, as we do find this sort of style a number of times by Rashi, that he can repeat something if it's much later. The question, however, is, in our parsha, why doesn't Rashi explain one of the previous psukim, or all the why is Rashi explaining it on one of the current psukim that we're speaking about again, between tes and yudches, so psukim yud, yud aleph, tes vav, yud zayin? Why does he not explain it the first time luchos is missing those vavs, which is in pasuk tes? Says the Rebbe, we cannot say that the reason why Rashi is explaining it specifically here in pasuk yud aleph, or perhaps pasuk yud zayin, is because the word luchos is spelled without both vavs. That means there should have been a vav after the lamed. There should have been a vav after the ches. And in these two psukim we just mentioned, it's missing both vavs. And that's why he doesn't explain it in Pasuk Tes or Yud. Well, it doesn't explain it in Pasuk Tes for sure not. Perhaps he's not even explaining Pasuk Yud, where the word luchais does at least have one lamed after the vav. Why can't we say that that's why Rashi is not explaining it on those words? Because the content of why the word luchais means singular, and that's why they're equal, is what's relevant is only that second vav. The vav after the ches, which makes instead of luchais, it makes it luchas. Whereas the first, that's what's making it into Lashon Yachid, into singular from plural. Whereas the first vav after the lamed, as far as the word going from plural to singular, that makes absolutely no difference. In other words, even when the first vav is there with a vav, it would still be luchas. In other words, it would still mean singular, so that first vav really makes no difference. And so we'd still be able to learn that the two luchas, the two stones, are equal. So we cannot say that that's the reason why Rashi is telling it to us over here, because it's missing both vavs. Furthermore, says the Rebbe, if in fact Rashi has to repeat the pirush that he said in Parsha Sicha, after a long interruption, because we had, after Parsha Sicha, we have the end of Chumash Shmois, Vayikra, Bamidbar, and now we're in Dvarim, Chumash Dvarim. So seemingly, if that's the reason, he should have told us this pirush, not even in our Parsha Ekev, but we have it already in Parshas Vayeschanan, in the previous Parsha. There too it says, after the Aseres HaDibros, the words luchos, missing a vav, the pasuk says, Vayichtevim al shnei luchos avonim, vayitnem eloi. It's also without the vavs. The Rebbe says, let's go back to Parsha Sicha for a moment. Really, we have the same question there as well. In other words, that's the first time that Rashi tells it to us. But really, it's not the first time that the word luchos is missing the vavs. This is already in Parshas Mishpatim, which is before Sicha. The pasuk says, "Va'etna luchos luchos ha'evan." Hashem is saying, "I've given you the luchos of stone," and there too, it's missing both vavs, exactly like in Parshas Sicha. So why is Rashi not explaining it in Parshas Mishpatim, where it says the first time luchos without the vavs, rather waiting until Parshas Sicha? Now, the Rebbe says, simply we would be able to answer it based on that which is known. That the actual concept of words missing letters or having all the letters is really not something that's a problem or a question in Pshutei Shel Mikra, in the simple learning of the pasuk, which Rashi needs to come ahead and answer. And this is obvious from the fact that, in the majority of the places, Rashi actually does not comment on words that are missing the letters or are mole, have all the letters. So the reason why Rashi sometimes does tell us about a missing letter, like in our case, so the reason is because, in other words, in our case, what might be the reason? This is the attempted answer that Rebbe is giving, is because in one pasuk, in the very same pasuk, in pasuk Yud Aleph in our case, the Torah actually changes within the same pasuk, one right after the other. It first says it's shnei luchos ha'avonim, missing both vavs, and then it says luchos habris, well, missing the first vav. It says it the second vav, which makes it into plural. Luchos. So first it starts in chaser. First it's completely missing vavs, and then immediately it has that second vav. So that's why Rashi comes to explain that the fact that the Torah is coming to tell it us, one right next to the other, is this obviously emphasizes the idea that the word is missing a vav. So why is it say luchos as if it was luchas? Is to teach you that they're both equal. And that would also answer why Rashi didn't tell this to us in Pasuk Tes, which is the first Pasuk in our Parsha, where it says, Ba'aloisi ahara, when I went up to the mountain to take luchos ha'avonim luchos habris, because in that case, both times luchos are written chasar. Both of them don't have that second vav. This would also explain why Rashi doesn't answer it in Parshas, doesn't explain it in Parshas Vayeschanan, where it says Vayichtevim al shnei luchos ha'avonim, as well as in Parshas Mishpatim, which was before Parshas Sicha, because again, in those places, the Torah only uses the word once, and therefore you wouldn't say, oh, there's a change within the same pasuk, and therefore drawing our attention. However, says the Rebbe, this is not enough of an explanation. For two reasons. Number one, in Parshas Sicha, which is the first time Rashi does explain it, so even though there the pasuk says twice the words luchos, luchos eidus, luchos evan, But in that case, actually, the Torah didn't change anything. Both times it says luchos without the vavs. And therefore, clearly the pasuk is not changing something in order to emphasize anything, and yet Rashi is explaining it. Point number 2, says the Rebbe, even if that would be a reason why we could say Rashi is explaining it over here, but all we did is we just moved the question from Rashi to the pasuk. We can now ask the question on the pasuk itself. Why is the pasuk coming and changing the spellings and hinting to this idea that the luchos are similar and equal? Why is it doing it only in the later pasuk, in our case, in our parsha, in pasuk Yud Aleph, rather than pasuk Tes, where it also says twice the same word? It could have just told it to us earlier in the parsha. And based on this idea that the question is going to move now to the pasuk, the Rebbe says this will also preempt another, or answer another, or deal with another answer that some people could try to answer, which is, one might try to say that in fact there's a number of different opinions and shittos in the tradition of chaseres v'yaseres, of which words have missing letters or have all the letters. In other words, someone could argue and say that according to Rashi, the tradition is that in Parsha Sicha, it says one time mole and one time chaser. In other words, that's what was bothering in Rashi in Parshas Kisisa. We said before that in Parshas Kisisa they both say without the vavs, but perhaps in Rashi's tradition one was mole and one was chaser. Maybe that's why he has to explain it. We could also someone could also argue and say that in our parsha, Rashi's opinion is that earlier on in pasuk Tes, which we're asking why couldn't Rashi explain it over there, before the words Vayishem Bar, perhaps in Rashi's tradition, both of them were chaser. But the Rebbe says that still wouldn't answer the question, because the question would still be on the pasuk itself. Why is the Torah coming and specifically changing it in the later psukim, whether it's in pasuk Yud Aleph or in Parsha Sisa, in order to emphasize that one time it says luchos without the vav, to tell you that they're both equal? Why doesn't the Torah tell it us in the earlier pasuk, in our case pasuk Tes, where it says also the two expressions luchos ha'avonim and luchos habris? So we're really back to the original question of why is Rashi specifically saying it on our psukim over here and not on the earlier psukim? Says the Rebbe, we're going to understand all of this by first looking at a certain diuk, at a certain the way Rashi is precise in his words, in his pirushim, ala Torah, in regards to this idea when words are missing letters or have extra letters, which we find within Rashi's wording itself some differences. We'll sometimes find that Rashi points out that the word is chaser vav, it's missing a letter. Or we might say chaser ksiv, it's written chaser, or similar sorts of expressions. In sometimes, like in our case, Rashi doesn't point out directly that it's missing a letter. Rashi just tells us how the word says in our pasuk, but he doesn't say it's missing a vav or chaser. Like in our case, Rashi does not say luchos is missing vavs. All Rashi says is luchas ksiv. It says luchas, which we understand, meaning as one instead of plural, and therefore we're translating it as they're equal, etc. Now, since we know that Rashi's wording is very, very precise, it's understood that these differences as well in Rashi's wording is intentional and for a reason. Especially when these differences that we find in a number of places, we find this in this Pirush al HaTorah, we see this going back and forth. Sometimes the first way that he's pointing out that the word is chaser, that it's missing something, and sometimes he doesn't point it out, he just says what the word says. Says the Rebbe, the explanation is as follows. But first, by some more explanation, in regards to the general rule that we mentioned before, that in Pshutei Shel Mikra, we don't really need to explain. There's no difficulty in Pshutei Shel Mikra when a word is missing a letter or has an extra letter, which Rashi has to come ahead and explain to the Ben Chamish L'Mikra. Generally speaking, Rashi doesn't have to deal with it. It's only if there's some other difficulty in Pshutei Shel Mikra, and it's going to be answered based on the fact that it has a missing a letter or an extra letter, then Rashi is going to explain it. However, says that but this rule that we said that Rashi usually doesn't deal with it is only in a case where there is no problem, question, contradiction in the word itself that's missing a letter, that something seems to be off about it because of the content of what's going on. In other words, in some cases, there's no real question. It's not a problem because of the pasuk that's missing a letter. It's just an issue of, why does the Torah have this word missing a letter? So we might be interested. And Rashi usually won't deal with it unless it's really necessary. But if in a case where because of the content and the context of the psukim, we look at this word and specifically it should have said with all the letters, not missing the letters. Or perhaps in some cases the opposite. In these cases, Rashi definitely will point out and look at it and explain why it's missing a letter. And the reason why Rashi will do that is because even though it's true that usually we don't have to deal with it in Pshuta Shel Mikra, but what does that mean? What we're saying is the idea that words have extra letters or missing letters is not a totally separate aspect of the Torah which doesn't have anything to do with Pshuta Shel Mikra, and only in certain cases Rashi is going to use it to explain something in Pshuta Shel Mikra. Like sometimes he'll use a medrash or an agada that will help us with the pasuk. That's not the case. In Pshuta Shel Mikra, it's also understood that if a word has an extra letter, is missing a letter, it's not just the way the Torah is writing the word, but rather it's relevant to what's being written over here and to the pasuk itself. In other words, the change, the difference of malay and chaser is obviously showing you that the word in some way is slightly different because it has that extra or missing letter. It's only, usually, what we're saying is that the explanation for why that is and how it expresses itself, in other words, what's the idea of missing the letter, have an extra letter, is usually something that's not really needed in the style of learning of Pshuta Shel Mikra. Rather, this is more in the area of other ways of learning Torah. And therefore, says the Rebbe, if based on the content of the pasuk, it specifically should have said with all the letters, and yet it's missing a letter. In other words, if we look at the content of the pasuk, it would seem to be that there shouldn't be anything lacking or missing, and yet this word is missing something. Rashi needs to come and answer the question for the Mechama Shel Mikra, why does it say chaser? What are we talking about? So the Rebbe gives some examples. The very first time in Torah where Rashi points out this idea that a word is missing something, the pasuk says, this is in the creation, Yehi mo'oros b'rekiah hashamayim, that Hashem is creating the luminaries, let the luminaries be in the heavens. Rashi says, chaser vav, which is referring to the fact that the word mo'oros, luminaries, is missing a vav. Why is that? Says Rashi, al shehu yoim me'era, because this day of the week is actually associated with certain curses. So the word mo'oros is missing the vav because there's something lacking over here. The word mo'oros is also like a curse, me'era, etc. Me'era means a curse. What's the problem with the fact that mo'oros is missing over here? Why does Rashi have to explain anything? Because the content of these psukim, which is speaking about how Hashem created the world and changed its bereshis, consists of and is bringing out the tremendous quality and the greatness of the things that Hashem is creating. We're speaking about Hashem's creation in the 6 days. Especially when we're speaking about something like creating the luminaries. And as the pasuk concludes over there, as well as in the rest of Ma'aseh Bereshis, Vayara likim ki tov, Hashem sees that it's good, it's perfect, it's beautiful. So therefore, the word mo'oros, speaking about the luminaries, should have been with the vavs, at least, with one vav at least, as in the later psukim. To emphasize that there's a certain shleimus, that there's a perfection. And this is what's bothering Rashi, and that's why he's going to say that it's something missing over here, and that's why he has to explain it. Example number 2. In Parshas Noach, after the Mabul, the pasuk says, "Vayorach Hashem es reach anichoyach." Hashem smells the beautiful aroma of Noach's carbon. Hashem says to himself, "I'm no longer going to curse the earth because of man." And then the pasuk says, "Ki yetzer leva odom ramen urav," because the person's yetzer, the person's inclination, his desires, is bad from his youth. In other words, saying that it's not so much his fault, and I'm not going to continue to strike the earth. On the word min urav, Rashi says, min urav ksiv. In other words, Rashi just says, like we said before, Rashi doesn't only say the word chaser. Rashi just says, it says min urav. In other words, because there's no vav, it could be read min urav, which could be understood, mishen ninar lotzeis mimei imoy, that the moment the baby is born, as soon as he's being shaken out of his mother's womb, he already has the Yetzer Hara. What's the problem in our pasuk? Since the pasuk is explaining that why Hashem is not going to curse man anymore, and the earth anymore, because he has a Yetzer Hara from his youth. So why would it then say chaser why would it then try to say as if there's something lacking over here in the word menu'urav, which would then indicate, menu'urav means from the youth. If you're taking out some of the word, maybe something missing, in other words, it's not, he doesn't mamish have it from his youth. Maybe it's somehow a little bit later. But the truth is, that would be the opposite of what the Pasuk is speaking about. The Pasuk is trying to emphasize that it's from the youngest age possible. So why would you want to take away from the word menu'urav, diminishing its meaning? And that's why, again, Rashi is bothered by it, and that's why he's going to explain it. And finally, example number 3. In Parshas Chayei, the pasuk says, "Ve'Ephron Yoshev." This is when Avraham Avinu is coming, wanting to buy the Ma'aretz HaMachpelah. It says Ephron is sitting. Rashi says the word the Ksiv Chaser. It's again written missing. The word Yoshev doesn't have the vav. That day, Ephron was appointed as a judge over them, etc. What's bothering Rashi over here? A similar idea. From the continuation of the Psukim, we're clearly trying to bring out the greatness of Ephron, the Bnei Ches generally and Ephron specifically, that he agrees to sell or to even give away the Ma'aretz HaMachpelah to Avraham for the burial of Sarah. So why would the pasuk right beginning speaking about Ephron Yoshev be written chas, be missing something as if there's something lacking by him? And again, this is what's bothering Rashi, and that's why Rashi has to explain it. Now let's go back to what the Rebbe started speaking about. That when Rashi points out the word chaser, is going to mean that the reason why the word is missing a letter. Again, the Rebbe asked the question why Rashi sometimes points out that it's chaser, and sometimes just says how it's supposed to be read. So the Rebbe says, now we're going to understand exactly why that is based on these examples we just gave. When the letter missing in the pasuk is in fact coming to emphasize that yes, there is something lacking over here, then Rashi is going to point out chaser ksiv, the word is missing something, because that's exactly the hint the Torah is trying to tell you, that in fact there's something missing. Whereas when the letter that's missing is not coming to tell you that in truth there's something missing, rather it's coming to teach us something else, or perhaps even maybe making the matter stronger rather than weaker, more emphasized. So Rashi is not going to use the words chaser ksiv, because there is nothing missing, nothing lacking. It's just that letter is not there because it's coming to show a change in the word, to hint to something unique and something different. So again, before giving the examples, when Rashi says chaser, it means that in fact that message that you were getting from the word in the pasuk that there's something missing, in fact, is showing that there is something missing. If Rashi doesn't point out that it's chaser, just telling you how the word is read now, that means there is nothing, although it seemed to be when Rashi just points out that there's that the way the word is read, Rashi is just coming to tell us there's in fact nothing missing. The word is supposed to be read differently because it's coming to hint and tell us something different, or again, emphasizing the idea. So to use the examples again. The first one, where it said Yehi Mo'eros, Rashi does say that chaser vav ksiv, it's missing the vav. Why? Because there is in fact Rashi says, because it's a day of curse, it's a day that babies, children get sick in a particular way. In other words, yes, in fact, there is something lacking, missing. Mo'eros is something so bright and beautiful in the Eibishter's creation, but it is coming to hint to some sort of deficiency, to some sort of problem, to some sort of curse. In the pasuk of Ephron Yoshev, that Ephron was sitting, Rashi again points out ksiv chaser, that it's written missing, because again there was a chisar, and there was something missing in Ephron, in his Yoshev, in the way he was sitting. As Rashi points out, it was only that very day that they appointed him as their officer. It was only in Avram's honor, because of the importance of Avram. That's why Ephron was so suddenly lifted up to greatness. In other words, the pasuk is in fact coming to say that Ephron himself is lacking, is missing, is nothing so special amongst the Bnei Ches. It's only that because of Avram, fine, now he was elevated to a high position of power. This is when he's starting to sit. So again, in these two places, because there in fact is something lacking and missing, Rashi points out the word chaser. Whereas in Parshas Noach, when the pasuk says Yetzel Lev Adam Ram Min Ne'urav, Rashi does not say that the word Menurav is chaser ksiv. Rashi does not say it's missing a vav. All Rashi says is how we read it now. Menarav ksiv. Mishenin arlotzis, the word in other words, instead of menu'ura, we can now read it, which has another meaning, that from when the baby shakes out of his mother's womb. In other words, we're not coming to say that there's something lacking in the youth, as we thought before, that maybe it doesn't mean literally from when he's very young, maybe it means a bit older. On the contrary, it's actually strengthening the word. It's coming to say that it's from even a younger age. Because what we're trying to do is to be melamed zchus, to give the person, to look positively on the person, to defend him. And what we're saying is, immediately, from when he's born, he has already a Yetzer Hara, and not only from his young age. And therefore, it's going to strengthen even more the reason why Hashem should not curse the earth because of man. Because Yetzer Lev Adam Ra, not only Menu'ura from his youth, but even younger than that. And the Rebbe says so too. We can find quite a number of other places where Rashi does, we find many places where Rashi does not say the word chaser, and it's exactly for this reason. The Rebbe is going to give another example now, but I just want to point out, in a very unique way, in this Sicha, L'Kutei Sichas, after the whole Sicha, the Rebbe goes through all the examples in the Torah where Rashi discusses words that are missing letters, again, sometimes pointing out that it's missing, and sometimes just saying how it's read, and the Rebbe explains in each one of them, after the Sicha, these notes after the Sicha, explaining each one of them how that fits with this rule that we're giving right now. So the next example the Rebbe gives is the first time in Chumash, only a few psukim after what we said before about the Ma'oris missing the Vav. So the first time where Rashi explains the idea that the word is missing, but he doesn't actually use the word chaser. So here the example is when Hashem is creating the fish. The pasuk says hataninim, which is referring to the big sea creatures. As Rashi is going to tell us, it means the leviosan. So Rashi says, brings from Agoda, this refers to the leviosan uben zugay, the leviosan and his mate. Hashem created a male and female, but Hashem killed the female and salted it for the tzaddikim la'asid lavoi, because if they are going to reproduce and multiply, etc., the world just wouldn't be able to exist in front of them. It would be, they're too big, too many, etc. And Rashi concludes, that's why hataninom ksiv. Instead of hataninim, which would mean plural, hataninom sounds like it's only one. But Rashi doesn't use the word chaser. He doesn't say chaser. He just tells us how it's written. Because the fact that hataninom ksiv, because the fact that Hashem killed the female, is actually not coming to show a deficiency in the creation of Hashem. On the contrary, the fact that Hashem removed an Ekev, that's coming to strengthen the world even more, that the world should be able to endure. And furthermore, even regarding the fish that Hashem did kill, the Ekev itself, it's also something because of a special reason. Hashem is salting it for the tzaddikim la'asad lavoi. So again, in summary, before moving on with the luchos, we have now a new klal, we have a rule that the Rebbe places. When Rashi is coming to explain why a word is missing a letter, very often it's because of the content of the pasuk that's speaking about something great, it shouldn't have been missing. That's what Rashi is coming to deal with. And when does Rashi write the word chaser, or when doesn't he write the word chaser? If in fact Rashi is going with along those lines, that yes, it's written missing a letter, because there is a deficiency, in fact, of what the pasuk is trying to tell us, the pasuk is trying to minimize it somehow, then Rashi will point out the word chaser. If not, if it's just meant to be read in a different way, but it's not coming to take away from anything, Rashi does not say the word chaser. So now let's apply this to the word luchos. Rashi is not just coming to explain why the word luchos doesn't have the vavs. Just like he doesn't explain many times in the Torah why words are written with their vavs or without their vavs. Rashi is only explaining it in places where the Torah itself is coming to emphasize how great the luchos were, and yet it says without the vavs. And that is in Parshas Kisisa and in our Parsha. Whereas the earlier times in the Torah, both Parshas Mishpatim, which was before Sisa, and in Parshas Vayeschanan, that comes before our Parsha Ekev, where the Torah is not focusing on the greatness of the luchos, Rashi is not bothered by and doesn't discuss and doesn't explain why the word luchos doesn't have the vav, as we'll clarify soon. So let's start off with Parsha Sisa. The pasuk says, "Vayitin el Moshe." Hashem gives the luchos to Moshe when he finishes speaking to him. Shnei luchos ha'edos, luchos even, these two luchos that are the testimony, luchos of stone, ksuvim be'etzba lekim, written with a finger, written with the hand of Hashem. Clearly, the pasuk is coming to tell us the greatness of the luchos. Let's look at our parsha. A similar idea, or even more so. The pasuk says, "Vayitin Hashem Eli." Hashem gave me the two luchos ha'avonim, the two luchos of stone, written by the finger of Hashem. On them was written all the words that Hashem spoke to you at the mountain from the fire. In continuation to this, the pasuk says, "Vayimi keitzar boim yom." After 40 days and 40 nights, Hashem gives me the two luchos ha'avonim, luchos habris, which is all coming in continuation to the idea of what the psukim are speaking about, of a choyrev iktzavtem, how you, the Yidden, made Hashem angry there when I went up to get the luchos. As an introduction to what Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu, go down from the mountain. And he goes down, he comes with the two luchos habris in his hands, and he sees the sin that the Yidden have done. He grabs the luchos, and he breaks them in front of their eyes. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu is coming to speak about the greatness of the luchos. That despite the fact that they're so great, yet because of the sin of the Yidden, it brought that Moshe Rabbeinu needed to break them. So therefore, this is what's bothering Rashi. If these psukim are speaking about the greatness of the luchos, so at least in these psukim it should have said not luchos without the vavs, which is showing on a chisarid something lacking. On the contrary, it should have said luchos mali. It should have said with the vavs to show the greatness of the luchos. So what does Rashi say? Luchas ksiv. In fact, the pasuk is not coming to tell us something, a deficiency about the luchos. On the contrary, it's actually coming to highlight and tell us even more great things about the luchos. The fact sheshteim shav is that they are both of equal size, of equal design, shape, and size, which is going to emphasize even more that this is a pure godly thing. How so? Says the Rebbe, in addition to the fact that something made by humans is very difficult or maybe even impossible to make so absolutely precise, exact, that two things should be literally exactly the same, there's a special chiddush by the luchos. On the luchos, we have the Aseres HaDibros. We have 5 written on one stone and 5 written on the other. Now, in the first 5 dibros, there's a lot more words, a lot more letters than the second 5 of the dibros. And nevertheless, they're both exactly the same size. One is not bigger than the other. And the Rebbe says, in the simple understanding of things, the size of the letters was exactly the same in both luchos. It's not like on the first luach, on the first stone, the words are written with smaller letters, and at the second one with bigger letters. Furthermore, the Rebbe says, it would seem to be that even the spaces between the words and the letters would have been exactly the same in both luchos. So in other words, we're speaking about something completely supernatural over here, and this is about the greatness of the luchos in the way they were inscribed, that yet, even though they seem to have such a different amount of letters in each one, and the size is the same, etc., etc., the size of the letters are the same and the same spacing, and yet the two luchos are exactly the same size. We also know the famous miracle regarding the luchos, how the letters were written from one side all the way through the other side. You were able to read it whichever side you looked at it, which is, again, as Rashi points out, a very miraculous thing. And therefore, it very much fits in with the content of these psukim, which are bringing out the greatness of the luchos that Hashem gave to Moshe. And on the other hand, it's also telling us how severe and terrible it is, and what Moshe Rabbeinu is warning the Yidden in their rebuke, that Moshe Rabbeinu is saying to them, remember and don't forget how you made Hashem angry at Choyrev, what brought to the Shviras HaLuchos. So that's in our psukim. Whereas in Parshas Voeschanan, where it said luchos without the vavs, in other words, chaser, so there, the psukim was speaking about how Hashem had spoken to the Yidden, told them the Aseres HaDibros. Vayichtevem, he wrote them on the 2 luchos avonim, on the 2 stones that he gave them to me. But we're not specifically focusing on the great quality of the luchos themselves. So too in Parshas Mishpatim, the pasuk says, Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu to come up to the mountain, and you'll be there, and I'll give you the luchos of stone, and the Torah, and the mitzvah that I wrote down to teach them. But it's not coming to emphasize the mila, the special quality of the luchos. So now the Rebbe goes back to pasuk Tes in our parsha, but the pasuk before, which we said Rashi is clearly not dealing with. So now we can understand why Rashi is dealing with the words luchos after pasuk tes and not the twice luchos that say in the beginning of pasuk tes. What did it say there? It says, "Ba'aloisi ahoro," when I went up to the mountain, lokachas luchos o avonim luchos abris, to take the luchos of stone, the luchos abris. So the Rebbe explains. So why doesn't Rashi comment on those? So the Rebbe explains the point of those psukim. The point of the psukim we're discussing in our Sicha most of the time of Yud Yud Aleph after pasuk tes is about the way the luchos were already being given to Moshe. Vayitin Hashem Eli, Hashem gave it to me. Vayimiketz arboim yoim, after 40 days, Nasan Hashem Eli, Hashem gave it to me. Whereas in pasuk tes, that earlier pasuk that we're curious about why Rashi didn't comment over there, is speaking about how Moshe Rabbeinu goes up to get the luchos, but we're speaking about how the luchos are still by Hashem. So the Rebbe explains the main thing when we're trying to emphasize about the greatness of the luchos, to explain to the Yidden how terrible it is, that the fact that they caused it to be broken, is not coming to speak about so much about how the luchos were by Hashem when Moshe Rabbeinu went up to the mountain to get the luchos. It's specifically coming to speak about how Moshe Rabbeinu was coming to give these luchos to the Yidden. In other words, we're trying to say that even as Hashem gave the luchos to Moshe, down here, there was still something completely godly, something completely from Hashem, written by Hashem, not the way things are usually down here on earth by Nevroim, by creatures. And that's why the pasuk is not speaking about it when the luchos were up there, but rather once the luchos are already coming down. Based on all of this, says the Rebbe, we could explain one more point, B'yeinu Shol Torah, and that is that the word luchos in pasuk Yud Aleph, where is it chasor, where is it missing that second vav to emphasize that it's like one, is specifically regarding to the stone, luchos ha'avonim. Whereas when it says luchos habris, there it actually says with that vav that makes it into plural. Now the question that Rebbe has is, seemingly, the mila, the special quality of the luchos, that they were given from Hashem, they're written by Hashem, with all this miraculous thing that we're talking about, you would think that it's mainly because of the fact that they're luchos habris, the luchos of the covenant that Hashem made with the Yidden, the bris of Hashem with the Yidden. Not in the fact that they are the stones, the gashmi is dika stones. Seemingly, if any of them, which one should have been missing that second vav to make it into luchas? Instead of being by luchas ha'avonim being written like that, it should have said it by luchas habris, in order to emphasize the great bris that Hashem, their great quality, how much it's connected to Hashem. But says the Rebbe, based on what we just explained, that the main chiddush is as the luchos come down here, not how the luchos remain spiritual up by Hashem. We can understand now that this is the main point we're trying to say, that it's not, we're not speaking about how it's up l'mayla. We're speaking about that even the gashmiyus of the luchos, even as they come luchos of stone, and that's what Moshe Rabbeinu breaks in front of their eyes, even in the gashmiyus, the stone, it was a godly thing to the extent that they were both exactly equal in the same. And to the extent that we actually have here two opposites coming together, that even though, again, as we said before, that one luach, one of these stones has so much words and letters than the other, and it's the same size in the letter and the size of the letters, and yet here's the miraculous thing that even in the gashmi is the stone, they both are exactly the same and equal.